Emma stood at the tall glass doors of Jonathan Hale's office building, clutching a small paper bag against her chest. Her heart pounded as she looked up at the wide windows where the rainy sky reflected on the smooth surface. The city around her felt huge and scary. Everything was so shiny and cold compared to her small world of chipped paint walls and whispering winds. She took a deep breath, wiped her muddy shoes on the mat, and pushed the door open. Then the bell above her tinkled, softly announcing her arrival. Inside, the lobby felt warm and smelled of fresh coffee and leather chairs. She had been here before with her mother, but only in the waiting area. Today felt different. Today she was on a mission. Emma walked carefully across the marble floor, her small steps echoing in the quiet space. She kept her eyes on the ground, as if the shiny floor could suddenly rise up and swallow her. She reached the security desk where a tall woman with neat hair looked at her kindly. The guard squinted down at the little girl and smiled. "Hello there? Can I help you?" she asked. Emma clutched the paper bag even tighter. Inside it lay her birthday money, 10 crisp bills she had hidden in her sock for weeks. Her stomach fluttered at the thought of spending it here, in the heart of a place where millions were made every day. She swallowed and said, "I need to see Mr. Hale. Please." The guard raised her eyebrows. "Mr. Hale's very busy. Do you have an appointment?" Emma shook her head. She was not supposed to have an appointment. Her idea was too big for appointments. She had waited until today, her birthday, to ask her biggest wish. She said softly, "I need to buy a dad." The guard looked surprised, but she did not laugh or scold Emma. She knelt down so that she was at the child's eye level. "Buy a dad," she repeated gently. Emma nodded, tears forming in the corners of her eyes. She felt proud that she could speak her wish out loud, even though it was strange. "I have birthday money," she whispered. "I want to spend it on a dad." The guard smiled sadly and straightened again. "Go on up," she said, waving at the elevators. Emma's face brightened in confusion and hope. She stepped forward and pressed the button for the top floor. The elevator doors slid shut with a whoosh. Inside the cab, Emma held the paper bag to her chest and watched the floor numbers tick up. She stared at her reflection in the polished metal walls. Her brown hair was in 2 loose braids, and her dress had small pink flowers on a white background. She hoped she looked polite and serious. She practiced one more time what she would say to the man at the end of her journey. "Sir, can I buy a dad?" She imagined how it would sound to his ear, and it made her heart race with fear and excitement. The elevator stopped with a soft chime, and the doors opened to a long hallway lit by bright lights and lined with glass offices. Emma felt a tug at her dress and looked down to see her mother's hand on her shoulder. Claire knelt to meet her daughter's gaze. Her eyes glistened, a mixture of worry and love. For a moment, Emma thought her mother might sweep her away and cancel this plan. But instead, Claire reached into her purse and pulled out a Kleenex. She handed it to Emma with a gentle smile. Emma took it gratefully, dried her eyes, and stood. Tall, she slipped her mother's hand into her own for a heartbeat, then let go. Claire squeezed her shoulder and nodded. Emma remembered how her dad had died 2 years ago. She remembered the first birthday without him, how the house felt empty and cold. She missed his voice, his laughter. She missed the safety she felt when he wrapped her in his arms. Tonight, she wanted to find someone, anyone, to fill that space. She didn't know exactly how, but she knew where to try. They reached the door marked Jonathan Hale, Chief Executive Officer. Emma's breath caught. She knocked 3 times. Quietly, a voice called, "Come in." Emma pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was vast. A large mahogany desk sat at the center, with a high-backed leather chair behind it. The walls held framed newspaper headlines praising Jonathan's success. A wide window looked out over the city, the buildings beneath like tiny toy blocks. Emma felt small as she walked forward. She held out the paper bag like an offering. Claire stood by the door, unmoving. Emma looked at her mother, then turned slowly to face the man at the desk. He was tall and wore a dark blue suit that matched his sharp eyes. His hair was neatly combed, and he looked at Emma as if he expected her to disappear at any moment. Jonathan studied her face. He noticed the small smudge of dirt on her cheek, the flecks of pink from her dress, and the way her fingers trembled around the bag. He saw her courage. She opened her mouth to speak, then paused when he raised a hand. He motioned for Claire to come in too. Claire sat back and watched, her chest tight with worry. Emma's voice was barely more than a whisper. "Sir, can I buy a dad?" For a moment, time stopped. The rain on the windows seemed to fall slower. Jonathan's heart thumped in his chest. He blinked, convinced he had not heard correctly. Buy a dad. He looked at the bag, at the crease of the paper where it had been folded over. Something invisible in Emma's eyes tugged at him in innocence, a longing. He leaned forward. "Do you mean buy a dad?" he asked gently. Emma swallowed. "I have my birthday money," she said. "I counted it all by myself. I thought if I give it to you, maybe you can give me a dad." She looked at his suit pocket in case he had a price tag for hearts. "I don't know how much a dad costs," she murmured, "but I know how much I have." Her voice cracked, and she blinked back tears. Claire crossed the room in one step and knelt beside her daughter, wrapping her arms around Emma in a hug. Emma closed her eyes and let the tears fall freely. She put her cheek against her mother's shoulder and whispered, "I miss him so much." Jonathan sat back in his chair, the leather creaking, and he stared at the two of them. He had gained every success a man could ask, for power, respect, wealth, yet his heart felt a new weight as he watched this small girl cling to her mother. He had spent so much time chasing deals and numbers that he had never learned to comfort a child. He cleared his throat. "Emma," he said quietly, "I'm not sure you can buy a dad. Fathers are not for sale." His voice trembled slightly, though he tried to hide it. Emma lifted her head and peeked at him through her mother's embrace. He noticed how her big brown eyes searched his face, hoping for some answer. His chest tightened. She was offering him everything she had, her savings, her trust, her wish. He felt the stirrings of something deep inside him, a responsibility he had never known. He reached forward and unfolded the paper bag. Inside lay 10 crisp bills, edges sharp as hope. He laid them on his desk. Emma watched, puzzled. He put a hand on Claire's shoulder and said, "I think your money belongs with you, Emma." He slid the bills back across. Emma sniffled. "But sir, I want a dad." She sounded like a small bird with a big broken wing, soft and brave. Jonathan stood and walked around the desk. He knelt to Emma's level and held her gaze. "You can't buy a dad with money," he said. "But maybe a dad is someone who can give you time, who can be there for you when you need help." Emma frowned and tucked a braid behind her ear. "But I need a dad," she insisted softly. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small notebook. What if he said, "I promise to spend time with you, to help you with things you need, to listen when you have questions"? Emma tilted her head, like a mentor. She asked. Jonathan smiled. "Yes," he said, "someone you can count on." Emma bit her lower lip and looked at her mother for guidance. Claire nodded and wiped Emma's tears. Emma took a shaky breath. "Okay," she whispered. "But will you be my dad?" Jonathan's eyes stung. He swallowed hard and nodded. "I will be there for you," he promised, "as much as I can." Emma's face broke into a small smile, and she reached out to take his hand. Shocked at how warm her hand felt in his, he realized that in that moment, he was not just the richest man in the building. He was a person who had just made a promise to a child in need of love, and he intended to keep it. Jonathan Hale could not shake the memory of Emma's small, hopeful face. Even as he paced through his glass-walled office the next morning, he found his thoughts drifting back to the moment when she had asked if she could buy a dad. The city. Outside gleamed under the rising sun, but inside him, a quiet storm was brewing. He tapped his pen on the desk, stared at the empty chair where Emma had sat, and realized something he had never admitted before. He cared. He cared enough to learn more about the little girl who had wandered into his life with her paper bag of birthday money. He leaned over the edge of his desk and called his assistant. "Mara, find out who she is," he said, his voice firm though. He did not fully understand what he was asking. Mara raised her eyebrows, but she did not hesitate. She made a few quick calls, typed into databases, and within an hour returned with a small file. Emma Carter, age 7, lived with her mother, Claire Carter, in a modest apartment on the east side of town. Her father, Robert Carter, had passed away 2 years earlier in a car accident. Claire worked double shifts as a waitress. Emma had no siblings. Jonathan read the details again, feeling something ache in his chest. He whispered her name as if saying it aloud would make her real to him. That afternoon, Jonathan told Mara to arrange a visit to the address. He insisted on going himself, though Mara warned him that it was outside his usual charity work. She tapped at her tablet, then nodded. "Of course, sir," she said, though she looked surprised. Jonathan did not mind her surprise. He slipped out of his sleek heels and into a simple pair of loafers, traded his tailored jacket for a casual sweater, and drove across town in one of the company cars. Left the city towers behind and felt the streets become quieter lined, with brick buildings that showed paint peeling at the corners. He parked a block away and walked the rest of the way, trying to steady the nervous flutter in his stomach. When he reached the old apartment building, he saw laundry hanging from lines stretched between windows and children's bikes left on the steps. He climbed the stairs to the second floor where the hallway smelled faintly of cooking and cleaning detergent. He paused at apartment 2B, where the door had a small wreath made of paper flowers. He knocked softly. A moment later, the door opened just a crack, and Claire looked out. She wore a tired expression and an apron stained with grease. Her eyes widened when she saw Jonathan Hale standing on her doorstep. "Mr. Hale," she whispered, her voice wavering between surprise and fear. "What brings you here?" Jonathan held out his hands, palms up. "I wanted to see Emma's home," he said gently. "I know you don't know me well, but I care about your daughter." Claire looked at him as if he had become invisible, then shook her head. "I'm sorry, sir," she said quietly. "Can't." She started to close the door. Jonathan slid a step forward and placed his hand on the frame. "Please," he said softly. "I won't stay long. I just want to understand her world." Claire hesitated. She glanced down the hallway, then back at him. Finally, she stepped aside and opened the door wider. "Come in," she said, her voice low. Inside, the apartment was small. A narrow living room led into a tiny kitchen, and a single bedroom lay beyond a thin curtain. The walls were painted a pale yellow, but the paint was chipped at the corners. A small table sat in the corner, covered with mismatched placemats. On it stood a vase with a few wilted daisies. Jonathan's gaze followed Emma's life as he walked. He noticed the worn-out book on the shelf, titled Daddy's Story, with a torn dust jacket. He felt a lump in his throat. "Emma drew pictures of families," he said, nodding toward a stack of her drawings pinned above the table. Claire sighed and sank onto a chair. Jonathan joined her, careful to keep his distance so as not to overwhelm her. "These are her drawings?" he asked, pointing gently. Claire nodded, rubbing her hands together. "She draws a family a day," she said. "Some days, she draws 3. She likes to imagine what life might be like with a dad around. She draws us on picnics, at museums, even on the moon." She offered him a thin smile. She misses him. A lot. Jonathan looked at the drawings. A small girl holding hands with a man taller than the sun, both smiling under a sky filled with stars. He closed his eyes briefly, recalling the promise he had made. He opened them and reached into his pocket, pulling out a crisp bill. Claire's eyes flicked to it, then narrowed. Jonathan laid the bill on the table. It sat there, shining awkwardly under the kitchen light. Claire's shoulders tensed. "I know Emma tried to give you her birthday money," Jonathan said. "Returned it to her. I don't want money. I want to help." Claire swallowed hard. She looked at him, then at the bill, and back to him again. Finally, she stood and picked up the money. Without a word, she walked to the door and ushered him out. She closed the door gently behind him, leaving Jonathan standing in the hallway. He pressed his forehead against the door, feeling a sting of failure. He had wanted to do the right thing, to show Claire and Emma that they did not have to face the world alone. but he had only reminded Claire of their loss. He walked back down the stairs more slowly this time, each step heavy. Outside, the sky had darkened, and a few raindrops began to fall. He pulled his sweater tighter around him and headed back to his car, vowing to try again another day. He could not leave things as they were. That night, he sat in his study, surrounded by awards and framed photos of his success. He opened his laptop and drafted plans. He would arrange for extra tutoring for Emma, enroll her in a local art class, and arrange safe after-school care. He would contact community centers and find volunteer opportunities for Claire that paid better than the diner job. He typed lists of names, numbers, and programs, his fingers flying over the keys. As the clock ticked past midnight, he leaned back and rubbed his eyes. His head felt foggy, but his heart felt lighter. He had a plan, and he believed it would help. The next morning, he called Mara, set up a meeting with the local children's center, he said, and find me scholarship information for after-school programs. Mara agreed and asked if he needed anything else. Jonathan paused. Then he said, "Also, I want to hire someone to help Claire with a new job search." He heard Mara jot down notes. She asked when he wanted to deliver the news. "Tomorrow afternoon," he replied. "I'll come with her to meet the tutor and the job coach." He hung up and stared out his office window. The city hummed with life. Somewhere out there, Emma was eating breakfast, wondering if she had done something wrong by asking for a dad. He hoped she would forgive his awkwardness. He hoped Claire would trust him again, hoped he could make things right. At 2 o'clock the next day, Jonathan drove back to Claire's apartment. This time, Mara followed quietly behind in her own car. Claire opened the door, surprised to see both of them. Her eyes widened when she saw a man in business clothes and a woman carrying folders. "Mr. Hale?" she said, half smiling, half worried. Emma peeked around the corner, her eyes curious but cautious. Jonathan crouched and spoke to Emma in a gentle voice. "I made a few calls," he said. "I found someone who can help you with your art, and I found a new job opportunity for your mom." Emma's eyes lit up, and she moved forward slowly. Claire's hand covered her mouth in disbelief. Jonathan handed Claire an envelope. Inside were phone numbers and letters of recommendation. "Take your time," he said. "Call them when you're ready." Claire's throat tightened. She nodded and hugged the papers to her chest. Jonathan looked at Emma and smiled. "How about we visit that art class this weekend?" he asked. Emma grinned and nodded so hard her braids swung back and forth. Jonathan stood, feeling a warmth spread through him. Claire stepped forward and took his hand. She shook it firmly, her eyes shining with gratitude. Emma reached out and took his other hand. The three of them stood in the narrow hallway, connected in a way that was new and strange but felt right. Jonathan looked down at Emma and promised silently that he would never let her feel alone again. As he walked back to his car, he realized that discovering their heartache had given him a chance to become part of their healing. That chance was more precious than any deal he had ever made. Jonathan woke early, the sunlight cutting through the curtains of his bedroom. He felt a mix of excitement and nerves. Today, he would invite Emma and Claire back to his office. He dressed carefully, choosing a softer blue shirt instead of his usual crisp suit, hoping it would feel less formal. He wanted Emma to feel comfortable. He drove across the city with the windows down, breathing in the cool morning air. He thought of Emma's bright eyes and her small, hopeful voice asking if she could buy a dad. He wanted to do something more than plans on paper. He wanted to show her he cared. When he arrived at the office, he found Mara waiting. She carried a folder labeled Emma Carter. Inside were details of a scholarship fund for Emma's school, a list of art classes, an after-school program. Contacts. On the table was also a small, wrapped box. Something simple. Something from a gift shop. Jonathan nodded. "Everything looks good," he said quietly. "Let's do this." Amr smiled, then moved to open the door when the elevator chimed. Emma and Claire stood there, dressed in their Sunday best. Emma held a small backpack, her fingers playing with the straps, and Claire carried a single rose from their kitchen windowsill. The rose was pale pink, a sign of new beginnings in Claire's mind. Jonathan greeted them with a warm smile.
Welcome.
Back, he said. His voice felt softer than usual. Emma's eyes widened at how different the office looked without the heavy tension of their last visit. The desk still shone, but there were now 2 small chairs on the other side, their cushions bright green. He motioned for them to sit. Claire sank into one chair, her shoulders relaxing slightly. Emma sat carefully in the smaller chair, hugging her backpack to her chest. Jonathan joined them behind his desk, leaning forward on his elbows. He opened the folder and slid it across to Claire. I spoke with the school board, he said. Emma's scholarship is approved. She can attend any art class she chooses, free of charge. Claire's eyes filled with tears. She looked at Jonathan, then at Emma. Emma's jaw dropped. Really? She whispered. Jonathan nodded. You have so much talent, he said. I reviewed your drawings, and I want you to keep creating. Art can help you find joy and express your feelings. Emma's eyes sparkled. She unzipped her backpack and pulled out a small sketchbook she had brought. Inside were rainbow-covered pages and family drawings. Jonathan gently took the sketchbook and flipped through the pages. He paused at one drawing of a dad and daughter. Hugging under a tree, he felt a warm ache in his chest. He handed the sketchbook back. This is wonderful, he said. Emma beamed. Claire's hand covered her mouth as she smiled through tears. The office felt smaller now, filled with hope. Jonathan turned to the wrapped box on his desk. I have something for you, Emma, he said. He handed it to her. Emma's fingers trembled as she untied the ribbon and lifted the lid. Inside lay a small silver locket on a thin chain. It was simple and pretty. Jonathan watched her as she held it up, the light reflecting off its surface. Emma opened the locket and found 2 tiny photographs, one of her and her mother, and another of her father smiling. Claire gasped softly. Emma's tears fell as she closed the locket and held it to her heart. It's beautiful, she whispered. Thank you. Jonathan felt his own eyes sting. He had asked a colleague to photograph moments they shared. So Emma would always carry love close to her. Emma pressed the locket into her dress pocket and looked at Claire. Claire nodded and Emma turned back to Jonathan. She bit her lip and whispered what he already knew she would say. Sir, can I buy a dad? Jonathan inhaled slowly. He had prepared for this moment, but nothing could erase the weight of her words. He leaned forward and placed his hand over the folder. Emma, he said gently, you don't need to buy a dad. Dads are not something you can purchase with money or gifts. No. Emma's shoulders slumped. She reached into her pocket and showed him the $10 bill her mother had smoothed after their first meeting. I still have this, she said softly. It's all I have. Jonathan's heart cracked. He reached out and took her small hand, squeezing gently. You don't need to spend that, he said. Let me explain something important. He stood and walked around the desk to kneel beside Emma. He looked her in the eyes and spoke softly. I promise to be there for you, not because you gave me money, but because you showed me your heart and trust. A dad is someone who cares, who listens, who supports you. That is not for sale. It is a gift that grows over time. Emma tilted her head, studying his face. Her tears had dried, leaving a shine in her eyes. Will you really do that? She asked, her voice hopeful. Jonathan nodded. I will help guide and stand by you whenever you need me. Emma let out a breath and hugged his arm. Jonathan wrapped his own arm around her small shoulders. He felt her trembling with relief. Claire watched them, her eyes bright with gratitude. Jonathan led them to the window seat where he had placed fresh flowers, handed Emma the rose she had brought. This is for you, he said, a reminder that beauty can grow even after hard times. Emma smiled and tucked the rose into her backpack. Claire stood and approached him. She took his hand and spoke softly. Thank you for believing in us, she said. Jonathan felt a warmth spread through him. He realized the impact of small kindnesses. He had the power to change lives, not just through big business deals, but through simple human actions as they prepared to leave. Mara entered with a photographer who had captured the moment. He took a photo of the 3 of them, Claire on one side, Emma in the middle holding her sketchbook, and Rose and Jonathan kneeling beside her with a proud smile. Jonathan paid no mind to the flashing lights. To him, the real picture was the warmth in Emma's eyes and the strength in Claire's posture. He promised himself he would keep that image in his mind forever. On the drive home, Emma held the photo and traced their faces with her finger. Claire glanced at Jonathan in the passenger seat. He smiled back in the rearview mirror. They had formed a new kind of family, one built on trust and gentle promises. When they arrived at their apartment building, Emma jumped out and waved fiercely. At Jonathan, he honked, then settled back into his car as they walked inside hand in hand. Later that night, Jonathan sat in his living room holding the locket. He opened it to see Emma's photograph once more, felt his chest swell with purpose. He had offered more than money. He had offered his time, his presence, and his care. He knew the road ahead would have challenges. Balancing work and personal commitment was not easy. But he was determined. He closed the locket and placed it next to his bed. He whispered to the silent room, "I will be there, Emma." High above the city in the glassy towers of his success, Jonathan slept with a quiet smile. Below, in a small apartment, Emma drifted to sleep, clutching her art sketchbook and rose. Their worlds were different, but in that moment, they were connected by something stronger than money or status. They were connected by a promise, and that promise was the beginning of a new story, one where Emma would always have someone to call Dad. Each Saturday morning, Jonathan Hale looked forward to a special visit. He left his tall office building and drove to the small apartment where Emma and Claire lived. Emma would rush down the steps, her curls bouncing, and wrap her arms tightly around his leg. He lifted her up into a bear hug, careful not to spill his briefcase. Inside, Claire greeted him with coffee and fresh toast. The apartment felt warm, no longer heavy with loss. Emma showed him her latest drawing, a colorful swirl of stars and hands reaching out to each other. Jonathan praised her work as if it were worth $1 million. For Emma, a single word of praise from him felt more precious than gold. After breakfast, they chose an activity together. One day, Jonathan brought a stack of children's books. He curled up on the little couch with Emma beside him. She chose a story about brave knights and friendly dragons. As he read aloud, his deep voice grew soft and slow, filling every word with warmth. Emma nestled against him and asked questions about the pictures. When he paused, she giggled and pointed out the dragon's silly grin. He laughed too, loud enough that Claire peeked in, smiling at the scene. The story ended, and Emma clapped, eyes shining. Jonathan closed the book carefully and whispered that he hoped she would always find magic in stories. On another Saturday, Jonathan took Emma to her first soccer game. He bought 2 small foam hats in her favorite colors, and they sat on the grassy hill of the local park. The players on the field were older, but Emma's eyes followed every passing goal. She cheered so loudly that Jonathan had to cup his hand over his mouth. When the game finished, he knelt and asked if she wanted to kick the ball too. Emma's grin stretched wide. He led her to an empty corner of the field, placed the ball at her feet, and gave her a gentle push forward. She ran after it with determination. Tripped once, then got up and laughed as he helped her steady herself. She kicked again, and the ball rolled smoothly across the grass. She looked back at him with pride and shouted, "I did it, Dad!" Jonathan held out his arms and she jumped into them. He spun her around, and they both laughed until their sides ached. Meanwhile, Claire found ways to breathe easier. Jonathan introduced her to a career coach who helped her update her resume. They met at a small office near the apartment. Claire sat across from the coach, tapping her foot nervously. Jonathan escorted her in, offered a firm handshake, and left them. To work. Later, Claire emerged with a new sense of hope. She had an interview for a higher-paying job at a local school. That week, she nailed the interview and got the position. The relief in her eyes when she told Jonathan made him feel proud. He offered to help set up her home office space so she could prepare lessons in peace. Together, they cleared a small corner of the living room, added a desk, a lamp, and a plant. Claire smiled each time she sat down to work, knowing she had a partner cheering for her success. On rainy days, Jonathan brought board games to play with Emma. One afternoon, the wind rattled the windows as heavy drops pounded the roof. Spread a blanket on the living room floor and set out a colorful game board covered in winding paths and tiny plastic pieces. Emma chose a bright green player piece and Jonathan let her go first. She rolled the dice with all her strength, and the tiny cubes clattered across the board. Each turn, she bounced with excitement or scrunched her nose in concentration. When she landed on a shortcut, she let out a small whoop, and Jonathan applauded. He moved his own piece slowly, making a show of turning the dice with a worried look, then sighed in relief when he avoided a setback. Claire watched from the kitchen doorway, smiling at their playful banter. When Emma won the game, she jumped up and hugged Jonathan around his waist. He lifted her in the air and shouted, "Champion!" Her giggles filled the room. As the weeks passed, their bond grew. Jonathan learned Emma's favorite ice cream flavor strawberry, so he always stopped by the corner shop on his way to the apartment. He memorized Claire's morning coffee order, a latte with extra foam, and picked it up before meetings without being asked. He began to schedule his calls and presentations around the little rituals that mattered. Story time at 3, soccer practice at the park, and puzzle afternoons when the sky was gray. His colleagues noticed the new notes in his calendar marked Emma and Claire. At first, some teased him gently about secret family time. Others whispered rumors that the CEO had adopted a child, but Jonathan ignored the gossip. He knew what was real, the two people who waited for him each Saturday, whose smiles lit up his world more than any boardroom applause. One evening, Claire called Jonathan with a small worry. Emma had wet her bed again, something she had not done in months. Claire felt embarrassed and frustrated. Jonathan hurried over and found Claire comforting Emma in her pink pajamas. He knelt beside the bed and said softly, "Accidents happen. You're growing fast, and sometimes your body needs more time to catch up." He talked to Emma calmly, giving her tips to use the bathroom before sleeping and to drink less water at night. Then he took Emma to the store and let her choose new pajama, soft blue ones with little moons and stars. Emma examined them in the mirror and said they made her feel like a princess. That night he tucked her into bed himself, reading a short poem until her breaths evened out in sleep. Claire watched from the door, her eyes grateful. Jonathan realized that being there in the small moments was as important as grand gestures. He would fix leaks, change batteries in her nightlight, and sit quietly beside her when nightmares scared her awake. Of course, balancing work and personal life was not easy. On Mondays, he returned to the office with messages piling up and meetings scheduled back-to-back. His phone buzzed constantly. He sometimes stayed late to finish reports, worrying that a missed deadline could hurt the company. Still, every Tuesday afternoon, he stepped away at 2 o'clock. His assistant gently reminded him of his promise, and he left without guilt. He treated those moments like board meetings, essential, non-negotiable. He arrived at the apartment building, greeted by Emma's excited wave, and felt all tension melt away. The high-pressure world of mergers and acquisitions faded into the background when Emma opened her arms for a hug. One day, Emma asked if they could plant flowers together. Jonathan smiled and bought pots, soil, and seeds. In the small balcony outside the apartment, Claire helped them clear away empty containers. They mixed the soil, planted the seeds, and watered them carefully. Emma pressed the seeds into the dirt, covering them gently. Jonathan showed her how to tap the soil with her fingers to keep it firm. They placed the pots in the sunniest corner they could find. Every morning, Emma checked for sprouts. When a tiny green shoot emerged, she pointed and shouted with delight. Month by month, the stems grew taller, and little buds bloomed into bright daisies. The balcony no longer looked drab. It glowed with color. Claire often paused by the door to admire their work. Jonathan felt proud that they had nurtured something together, just as he nurtured their fragile hope and happiness. One evening, Emma stood beside her bed and looked at Jonathan. "Dad, can you help me with my school project?" she asked. He sat on the edge of her bed, and she brought him a drawing of a family tree. On the branches were stick figures labeled Grandma, Uncle Joe, even Mr. Thompson, her teacher, but the bottom branch meant for her father was empty. Jonathan nodded and said they would fill it in together. They cut out photos, wrote names, and discussed stories about her dad. Claire listened from the doorway, tears in her eyes. She thanked Jonathan quietly later. He said he was honored. They placed the completed family tree on the wall above Emma's bed. From that night on, whenever Emma looked up, she saw the space. where her dad belonged, but she also saw the branch where Jonathan's name glowed in red marker. Dad. Through every laugh, every tear, every small victory and setback, they built a bond stronger than words. Emma no longer asked if she could buy a dad. She knew she had one. Claire no longer worried she would face life alone. She had a partner who cared deeply. And Jonathan discovered a part of himself he never knew existed, a heart grown larger by love, a life enriched by simple moments. The world outside his window continued its busy hum, but inside their little circle, time slowed and stretched to hold every hug, every story, every shared sunset on the balcony. In those moments, they were a family, and their promise to each other was the greatest success Jonathan had ever achieved. The morning sun streamed through the curtains and fell across the little apartment like a warm hug. Today was Emma's 8th birthday, and excitement buzzed in the air. Emma woke early, her curls bouncing as she jumped out of bed. She hurried to the bathroom, splashed water on her face, and brushed her teeth until they sparkled. Claire knocked softly on the door and called, "Emma, sweetheart, are you ready?" Emma popped her head out and grinned, her eyes shining. "Almost, Mom," she called back. She slipped into the pale pink dress she had chosen the night before, one with tiny daisies embroidered along the hem, and ran downstairs. In the living room, balloons bobbed above a small table draped in a cheerful cloth. The table held a simple homemade cake, decorated with fresh strawberries and cream. Next to it stood a framed photo of Emma, Claire, and Jonathan, taken just a few weeks earlier at the art class opening. Emma's drawing of her and Jonathan holding hands smiled from the corner of the frame. Claire appeared carrying plates and forks, her eyes bright with pride. She adjusted a balloon string and said softly, "Happy birthday, baby." Emma hugged her mother tightly, then twirled around, making her dress swirl. "Thank you," she said. "It looks perfect." A knock sounded at the door, and Emma's heart fluttered. She knew who it was. Jonathan stepped inside carrying a single white rose and a gift wrapped in sky blue paper. He wore his usual gentle smile and a fresh blue shirt that matched the gift paper. Emma ran into his arms, and he lifted her off the ground in a bear hug. She giggled as he spun her around once, then carefully set her down. Jonathan placed the rose in a small vase on the table and handed Emma the gift. "Happy birthday, Emma," he said, his voice warm. Emma's cheeks flushed with joy as she untied the ribbon and opened the box. Inside lay a small, leather-bound notebook embossed with her initials. Jonathan explained, "This is your big dreams journal. You can write or draw anything you dream of doing one day." Emma's eyes widened. She opened it to find the first page already filled with a drawing of her, Claire, and Jonathan sitting on a bench under a tree, reading stories together. Claire knelt beside her and whispered, "He added that last night, while you were sleeping." Emma looked at Jonathan, her eyes full of wonder. He nodded and said, "Your dreams belong here." Emma hugged the journal to her chest. They gathered around the table as Claire lit 8 candles on the cake. Jonathan held Emma's hand as she closed her eyes and made her wish. For a moment everything was still, but for the soft hum of the city beyond the window. Emma's face glowed in the candlelight as she blew out all 8 flames in a single breath. Everyone cheered. She clapped, then looked around at the 2 people she loved most. She said, "I wished that we stay together forever." Claire and Jonathan exchanged a look, both feeling their hearts swell. They sliced the cake and served generous pieces on pastel plates. Emma took her first bite and closed her eyes in delight. "It tastes like sunshine," she declared. Claire laughed and said, "I learned from you that simple things can be the best." Jonathan added, "And that family is more than a word, it's the people we choose to share our days with." Emma nodded thoughtfully and offered a forkful of cake to her mother, then to Jonathan. They ate together, savoring each bite and each moment. After breakfast, Jonathan spread a blanket on the little balcony, and they brought out art supplies. He had bought a stack of watercolor paints, brushes, and thick paper. "Let's paint a memory from the past year," he suggested. Emma dipped her brush into pink paint and swirled it on paper. She painted the day he first came to their apartment, her shy smile. her mother's tears, and Jonathan kneeling beside her. Claire added strokes of green for the plants they had grown together. Jonathan painted the trophy he had won months ago. For the company's success, but in bright gold, because Emma had said real success came from kindness. Their paintings lay side by side, a trio of memories. Emma stood back to admire their work. She said, "This is our story." Claire wrapped an arm around her daughter's shoulders and said, "Yes, it is." Jonathan placed his hand over theirs and said, "And it's a story I will read again and again." They spent the afternoon at the park where Emma's new art class met. Jonathan held her hand as she introduced him to her teacher and classmates. They walked along the path lined with tall trees and green grass. Emma's friends waved and called, "Happy birthday, Emma." She beamed and whispered to Jonathan, "They know about you." He smiled and said, "That makes me proud." The art class, Emma showed her painting and talked about the locket and the journal. Her teacher praised her creativity and said she could display it in the school gallery. Emma's chest puffed with pride as Jonathan clapped along with the rest of the class. On their way home, they stopped at the corner shop for strawberry ice cream cones. Emma licked the creamy treat and said, "This is the best birthday ever." Jonathan joked, "Even better than a new bicycle?" Emma laughed and said, "Yes, because it's not just a gift. It's our day together." Claire leaned against Jonathan and said, "I'm grateful for this family." That evening, back in the apartment, Emma prepared for bed. She slipped into her pajamas with moons and stars and climbed into bed. Jonathan sat beside her with the family photo album he had made. It was small, with a soft cover and thick pages. On each page he had printed pictures of their moments together. The first meeting in his office, the art class, the soccer game, the balcony garden, the board game nights. Next to each photo, he had written a small note, first laugh, growing, strong, rooting hope, and so on. Emma's eyes grew heavy with happiness as he turned each page. When he reached the last page, he paused. It was blank. Emma looked up sleepily and said, "Is it for me?" He nodded. "Yes, it's for our next adventures." Emma smiled and whispered, "Can we fill it tomorrow?" Jonathan kissed her forehead and said, "Absolutely." He closed the album and tucked it in next to her pillow. He turned off the light and sat in the dark for a moment, listening to her even breaths. All around him, the apartment felt soft and full of peace. As he stood to leave, Emma stretched out her small hand. He took it in his larger one and squeezed gently. "Good night, Dad," she murmured. His heart warmed at the word. He bent and kissed her cheek, then whispered, "Good night, Emma. I love you." He crept quietly from the room, closing the door softly behind him. In the quiet of his own apartment that night, Jonathan held the locket once more and opened it to see the tiny photos inside. He placed it next to the family album he kept on his desk. He looked out the window at the city lights, his mind at rest. He had built an empire on ambition, but now he had something far more precious, a family. Of his own choosing? Miles away, in her dreams, Emma painted new pictures of tomorrow. Claire slept peacefully, her heart unburdened by fear. And Jonathan slept with a promise held close, that no matter where life led them, they would always wake together to a new chapter in their story, a story written with love, hope, and the gentle promise that family cannot be bought, but can be given freely from one heart to another.